Our panel on applications and lesson learned. And just on behalf of all the speakers, we all consider it a great privilege to be able to address the Heartland Institute conference here. These conferences are awesome, and all the speakers agree with that. And as far as those of you here and watching online, I encourage you to read the entire bios of these speakers. They all have very prominent stats behind their name, and you can see that online under about speakers. And here, our first speaker is on page 15, and it is Richard Trzupek, and he's a chemist. And my daughter is getting into chemistry, just finished AP chemistry, and is going into an honors program. She loves chemistry. I said physics, but chemistry. And he's been employed in environmental consultant industry for more than 25 years. And like I said, lots of other stuff here, but I want to give him more time to talk. So let's welcome our first speaker.
Thank you. I do appreciate being here. I love what Heartland does. Gotta always say that. I'm going to ask you to take a departure from reality for a minute for my talk. Okay. So exactly, we're going to pretend that global warming is a problem that needs solving. And just go to the warmest side for a minute. I'm not there either, but the IQ of the room just dropped about 40 points when we were doing that. But we're going to do that. So the argument that we hear from the other side is this is a problem that we're not doing anything to address. And the reality is we're doing so many things to address, some of which other speakers have talked about, and I'll kind of breeze through, but other of which are more stealthy things. And the question is should not be this election year, what else do we need to do, or do we need to address global warming? It's we got to do something to roll back all the things that we've already done over the last 4 years. So what I'm calling the regulatory tsunami. Let's take a look. We'll start out with this. This is a statement in the latest greenhouse gas report that the US EPA issued, that greenhouse gas emissions have increased 11% from 1990 to 2010. Now, where have we seen before where somebody picks two data points from a big data set and draws a line between them and says that's representative of a trend? Have we seen that anywhere before? I think we have. Yeah, maybe. So I blocked out, that's the statement that's in the executive summary. And where do we see big statements like this in executive summaries before? If you go back into page 430 something of the report, you have this graph, which I've blocked out the middle, because right now it's representative of what that statement in the executive summary says. Here's the actual graph. You think? It is.
Cover up that right part.
Yeah. It is going down, and it will continue to go down. Now, what the other side is going to argue, if you point this out to them, is say, well, that really has more to do with the economy. The economy has something to do with it, but the bigger part of it is the regulatory environment. What programs are in place and what is going to continue to be in place that will continue to drive this number down to the detriment of the economy. So let's start looking at those. Greenhouse gas reductions are being fired on from all sides. Some of them are direct attacks, like permitting and limits on greenhouse gas emissions, regional programs, renewable portfolio standards, and all the stupid subsidies we are pouring into windmills and solar farms. But there's also indirect regulation that affects fossil fuel and the availability of cheap, reliable energy as well. And we'll talk about those indirect regulations as we go through here. The basic message of this administration is that coal is bad, but gas is good, or at least gas is okay for the time being. The environmental groups consider gas a bridge fuel. A bridge to what? I don't know, but right now they're not getting in the way of gas. I think with the gas boom that the gas companies, the big gas companies like Chesapeake, are starting to catch on. Maybe we don't want to really get in bed with the environmental groups because they will eventually turn on us. But right now, they're of course focusing on wiping out the last vestiges of coal. Greenhouse gas permitting is where it all started under this administration. Basically, any kind of facility that emits 100,000 tons per year of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions or more has to go through permitting if you're building a new plant. That's a very small plant. 10 megawatts in the power world is almost nothing. And then as part of that permitting process, you have to demonstrate that they're using best available control technology. There is no coal plant that will be able to meet that definition as defined by this EPA. So new coal plants essentially are dead in this country. And there's detailed guidance, and guidance documents are really insidious things in my world, on how to permit coal plants that directly tell the states, here's everything you have to do, here's all the hoops that a coal plant would have to go through to be built, and it just is not going to happen. Greenhouse gas limits, I know Alan's going to talk more about that. The interesting thing about actually having a limit on greenhouse gas emissions now is that the Clean Air Act is kind of specific, that you're not supposed to force technology one way or another. You're not supposed to game the system towards one type of technology, like natural gas versus coal. The way the EPA got around this in the preamble of this rule is to say, well, even though there's no cost-effective means of controlling CO2 from a coal-fired power plant today, we think there will be in 10 years. So we'll let you average your CO2 emissions from a new coal-fired power plant over a 30-year period with the idea that in 10 years something magical will happen that will make it both effective and affordable. Imagine going to a bank to finance a project with that in mind. Just think about that for a minute. But that's where this EPA is at. There are regional programs. There's been a trading program in the East Coast that's been active since '09. It's driving down the use of coal. There's the Midwest Greenhouse Gas Reduction Accord and the Western Climate Initiative, which are both working towards those. I think both of those are likely to eventually produce regional cap and trade programs as well. There are renewable portfolio standards, and this map shows the renewable portfolio standard states. An RPS is basically a directive at the state level that to reach a certain target of electricity produced within the state using renewable sources, wind, solar, biomass. Basically, it drives the use of fossil fuels down even more. Interestingly, in California, they have one of the most interesting renewable portfolio standards. Hydropower is not renewable. I don't know why. I thought the water cycle kind of worked when I was taught it in college, but yeah.
Right. Because it's effective, that's why.
Because it's effective, yes, correct. Here's just some examples of renewable portfolio standards in motion. I've given you the target percent, that's the percent of electricity that has to come from renewables, and the target year, and the equivalent greenhouse gas reductions that will occur. These are huge greenhouse gas reductions. It also implies, as you know, so many speakers have said, that it makes power more expensive, makes power less reliable, although I don't want to lean too heavy on that. And it also requires, as you put up more wind, it requires fossil fuel backup anyway. Basically, for the grid, it increases reserve requirements that has to be fossil fired. Why the subsidies? Well, it's really a matter of cost versus reliability. I kind of plotted, as you go up on the y-axis here, higher costs, and as you go across on the x-axis, more reliable. The most reliable power is nuclear. Nuclear averages capacity factors well in the 90s all the time, and the cost, once the plant is built, is dirt cheap. Coal, the capacity factor goes down a little bit, but still it's the cheapest form of fossil fuel. Gas, a little more expensive, just as reliable. By the time you get to solar, for doing any kind of base load or any kind of even peak load electricity generation, the costs are ridiculous and the reliability is practically nil. We talk about capacity factor in the power world, and a good capacity factor for a coal-fired power plant will be in the 70s or the 80s. That's if the plant could have produced 100,000 megawatts in a year. If it's got an 80% capacity factor, it means it produced 80,000. Anybody care to guess the national average capacity factor for solar plants? Give that man a cheroot. That's it. 16%. We're building plants that don't do anything 84% of the time. You know, when the president was out in Las Vegas at or Nevada, I don't know if it was Vegas or not, at the biggest solar plant in the country, which is a piddly 58 megawatts, by the way. And they said, well, it's enough power to heat 17,000 homes. Well, yeah, it's enough power to heat 17,000 homes if they're willing to have their lights off 11 months out of the year. That's solar power. This, I think, is self-explanatory. People ask me about Obama's energy policy, this is it. Yeah, there's got to be a parachute somewhere on the way down, right? Okay, indirect regulation. We'll go through these pretty quick. And this is the most insidious, because in the regulatory tsunami and piling on and making sure you can't build coal plants, not only is there all this direct stuff that really, you know, clearly targets it, but there's all this little stuff that only geeks like me understand are really just attacks on coal. National ambient air quality standards are how we define clean air in the environmental world. It's how much of each pollutant is allowed. And that's always a moving target, because the EPA needs to make work, so if they hit one target, they move it down to another. This also keeps me gainfully employed, which I'm, you know, very, very appreciative of, but it gets a little ridiculous. The new short-term nitrogen oxide standards that the Obama administration put in are another blow against coal, because you can't build a plant that you know will violate a national ambient air quality standard, and this standard is so low that there's not a coal plant you can build that would meet it. Sulfur dioxide standards is the same story, and the interesting thing that they're trying to do with the sulfur dioxide standard is that rather than show compliance with that standard in the ambient air through monitors, which is what we've done for 40 years, they're saying, well, no, we're going to model. Okay. We're going to model the emissions and determine compliance that way. Models are so conservative, and as we know from global warming world, so inaccurate, that this is just a way of guaranteeing that there will be violations so that you can keep going after industry. New boiler rules, we have what are called MACs, Maximum Achievable Control Technology rules, for both boilers and industrial boilers and utility boilers. The goal, supposedly, is to reduce toxic emissions. The reality is, all it is trying to do is stick it to coal and get the EPA inside the power plant control room. For instance, they have energy efficiency audit requirements. Well, most good companies care about how much energy they're using. They're doing that anyway. You know, they really do want to keep their fuel costs down. What this does, when you have the federal government telling you that you get energy efficiency standards, that's a way of getting the EPA into the control room like they've never been before. Enforcement, this gives me flashbacks from my childhood at St. Florian on the south side. Small coal boilers, municipal boilers, co-ops, they're targeted. The message the EPA is sending to them is, nice boiler you got there, I'd hate to see anything happen to it. So either switch to biomass or shut down, but if you're on coal, we're going to find a violation and we're going to stick it to you. You know, when what's-his-name in Texas did the analogy with crucifying and the Romans going into Turkey and crucifixion, on my side of things, we're like, well, yeah, that's what they do. Why is anybody surprised? Yeah, exactly. The end game here is that 50 to 80 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants are going to be retired over the next 5 years. Natural gas has to fill that gap. The good news is we got such a shale gas boom, we can probably do that affordably and quickly. But over the long term, that as people fill markets for natural gas prices historically fluctuate a lot. Coal has been the stabilizer in the power industry. Without that stabilizer, over the long-term future, if something doesn't change, it's going to have severe economic consequences over the long term. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.